Video introduction, The Great Counting. Visuals, a montage of flickering candlelight, old parchment paper, and the rhythmic sound of a quill scratching. We see a map of the original 13 colonies. Narrator voiceover. 1790. A nation is born, but its people are yet to be counted. Under the command of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, 650 marshals set out on horseback. No digital records. No paved roads. Just heavy ledgers, homemade ink, and the grit to define a democracy. This is the story of the first US Census, where every drop of ink represented a living soul. 10 chapters. One historic mission. Let's begin. Series Overview, the 10-chapter road. Chapter 1. The Mandate. Philadelphia, 1790. The air in the temporary capital was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the salty breeze from the Delaware River. Inside a modest brick building, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, sat hunched over a mahogany desk. Before him lay the United States Constitution, its ink barely dry in the grand scheme of history. Article 1, Section 2. It was a simple sentence that demanded an impossible task, an actual enumeration of the people. The weight of a number. Jefferson knew that this wasn't just a head count, it was a battle for power. The number of people would determine how many seats each state got in Congress, and more importantly, how much tax they would pay. The atmosphere was tense. Southern states whispered of undercounting to avoid taxes, while northern states feared losing their voice in the fledgling government. "We are a nation of ghosts, Mr. President," Jefferson remarked during a meeting with George Washington. "We claim to represent a people we haven't even met." Washington, ever the pragmatist, nodded. "Then find them, Thomas. Find every soul from the Maine woods to the Georgia swamps." The logistics of chaos. The challenge was staggering. In 1790, there was no Census Bureau. There were no printed forms. There were no computers. The entire operation was handed to just 17 federal marshals. These men were given a tiny budget and a massive deadline. 9 months to cover hundreds of thousands of square miles. The marshals were told they had to provide their own supplies. There were no government-issued notebooks. The paper, they had to find large, durable sheets of parchment or sheepskin that could survive months in a saddlebag. The ink, it had to be iron gall ink, a pungent, acidic mix of oak galls and iron salts that literally etched itself into the fibers of the paper so it could never be erased or altered. The call to action. As the sun set over Philadelphia, the first set of instructions was dispatched by courier. The marshals were ordered to hire assistant marshals, mostly local farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers who knew the terrain. Each man was required to carry a wooden box containing his ledger, a quill, and a stone inkwell. They were to ask 6 simple questions. 1. Name of the head of the family. 2. Number of free white males over 16. 3. Number of free white males under 16. 4. Number of free white females. 5. Number of all other free persons. 6. Number of enslaved persons. As the first marshal, Samuel McDowell, prepared his horse in Kentucky, he looked at the dark forest ahead. There were no roads, only Native American trails and thick brush. He dipped his quill into the black ink and wrote the first heading on a blank sheet of paper. The Great Counting had begun. Chapter 2. The Marshal's Oath. The transition from a legal mandate to physical action was a heavy burden. To count a nation, you first had to find the men brave, or perhaps foolish enough to try. The weight of the badge. In the spring of 1790, 17 federal marshals stood in various courthouses across the original colonies. They were men of local standing, but the task before them was unprecedented. They weren't just lawmen anymore. They were the architects of a national identity. To ensure the integrity of the data, Thomas Jefferson insisted on a formal oath. Each marshal had to swear, with a hand on the Bible, that they would make a just and perfect enumeration. This wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty to the Republic. If they failed, or if they were caught falsifying numbers, they faced a massive fine of $800, a fortune in the 18th century. Recruiting the vanguard, the marshals quickly realized they couldn't do this alone. They needed assistant marshals, the boots on the ground. These were the men who would actually knock on doors. Finding them was a struggle. The pay was abysmal. About $1 for every 150 people counted in the city, and $1 for every 50 people in the sparsely populated countryside. "You'll be paid in pennies for miles of sweat," Marshal Clement Biddle warned his recruits in Pennsylvania. "You'll face rain that turns your ledgers to pulp and dogs that don't care for the government. Who among you stays?" Many walked away. But those who remained were motivated by a strange mix of patriotism and a desire to see the edges of the known world. They were frontiersmen, young lawyers, and local sheriffs. The gear of the census taker. Before they set out, these assistant marshals had to prepare their mobile offices. Since the government provided nothing but the instructions, the men had to be resourceful. The ledger. Most bought large folio-sized sheets of paper, often stitching them together by hand with linen thread to create homemade books. The inkwell. Small, portable traveling inkwells made of lead or horn, designed to be corked tightly so the ink wouldn't spill while galloping on a horse. The quill. Hand-carved feathers, usually from geese. The census taker would carry a dozen at a time, as the rough paper would dull the tips quickly. A journey into the unknown. As the marshals signed their commissions, the sheer scale of the geography began to sink in. There were no maps for much of the territory. The United States on paper was a neat collection of lines. The United States in reality was a chaotic expanse of swampy marshes in Georgia, thick, wolf-infested forests in Massachusetts, and the rugged, unpredictable Appalachian Mountains. There was no central office to call for help. Once a marshal left his town, he was on his own. He was the voice of the president, carrying nothing but a piece of paper and a bottle of ink into the heart of a wilderness that didn't always want to be found. By the end of the month, over 600 men were sworn in. They packed their saddlebags, kissed their families goodbye, and turned their horses toward the horizon. The silence of the American wild was about to be broken by the scratching of quills. To 5. The knock on the door. By the autumn of 1790, the census had reached the hearths of the common people. From the bustling merchant houses of New York to the isolated sod huts of the western frontier, the census man had become a figure of intense curiosity and, often, deep anxiety. The arrival. Imagine a typical farmstead in the Virginia countryside. The family is working the fields when a lone rider appears on the horizon. He isn't wearing a military uniform, but he carries a heavy leather satchel and a wooden case. This is the assistant marshal. As he dismounts, he doesn't ask for water or food first. Instead, he pulls out a large, hand-sewn ledger and unscrews a small lead inkwell. To the average citizen of 1790, who might only see a government official once every few years, this was a moment of profound significance. For many, it was the first time they realized they were part of something larger than their own town. They were part of a United States. The 6 questions and the great suspicion. The marshal would stand in the doorway or sit at the family's rough-hewn kitchen table. He was bound by law to ask 6 specific questions. However, the interaction was rarely simple. 1. Who is the head of this household? 2. How many free white males aged 16 and upward? The government needed to know the potential strength of the militia. 3. How many free white males under 16? 4. How many free white females? 5. How many other free persons? 6. How many enslaved persons? Many families were illiterate. They didn't track their ages with calendars or birth certificates. A marshal often had to help a father calculate his son's age by referencing historical events. Was he born before or after the Great Frost of '82? Or was he walking by the time the British surrendered at Yorktown? The suspicion remained high. In the 18th century, counting was almost always a prelude to taxing. Some farmers hid their older sons in the woods when they saw the marshal coming, fearing they would be drafted into a new war. Others exaggerated their numbers, hoping to gain more political influence for their district. The marshal had to be part detective and part diplomat, looking at the size of the shoes by the door to see if the numbers matched the story. The ritual of the ledger. The most fascinating part of the visit was the recording itself. The family would gather around to watch the marshal write. In an age where books were rare, seeing their names written in dark, permanent iron Gall ink was a transformative experience. The marshal's quill would scratch loudly in the quiet cabin. He had to be careful. One drop of sweat or a shaky hand could smudge a record that was meant to last forever. If the family was literate, they might lean over his shoulder to ensure their name, the family legacy, was spelled correctly. Public accountability. The job didn't end with the interview. To prevent fraud and ensure perfection, the marshal was required by law to post the completed list in two of the most public places in the city or district, usually the local tavern or the church door. This led to intense community drama. Neighbors would crowd around the posted parchment, checking to see if the man down the road had lied about his wealth or his household size. It was a moment of total transparency, where the private lives of Americans were pinned to a wooden board for all to see. As the marshal packed his ink and rode away toward the next chimney smoke on the horizon, he left behind a family that felt a new sense of identity. They were no longer just pioneers in the woods. They were now a data point in the grand experiment of democracy. Chapter 3. Paper and Iron. The success of the 1790 census didn't just depend on the courage of the men, it depended on the chemistry of their supplies. In an era before standardized office supplies, every assistant marshal had to be a bit of a scientist. The alchemy of the ink. The ink used for the first census was not the watery blue fluid we know today. It was iron gall ink, a permanent acidic substance that had been used by kings and scholars for centuries. To prepare for the journey, many marshals had to brew their own batches. The recipe was a strange concoction. Oak galls. These were small, round growths found on oak trees caused by wasps. They were rich in tannic acid. Copperas, iron sulfate. A chemical salt that, when mixed with the tannic acid, turned the liquid into a deep velvety black. Gum arabic. A resin from acacia trees used to keep the ink at the right consistency so it wouldn't run off the quill. This ink was unique because it didn't just sit on top of the paper, it actually bit into it. Over time, the iron would oxidize, turning the writing from a sharp black to a rich, rusty brown. This is why, even today, the original 1790 census records remain legible. The ink is literally part of the paper. The challenge of the paper in 1790 was a luxury. It wasn't made from wood pulp like modern paper, but from recycled linen and cotton rags. These rags were beaten into a pulp, pressed into sheets and dried. The result was rag paper, thick, textured, and incredibly durable. However, there was a problem. The government had not provided any official forms. Every marshal had to rule their own lines using a lead pencil or a ruling pen. Some marshals used massive sheets of parchment made from animal skin for the final copies to ensure they would last for generations in the freezing vaults of the capital. Survival in the saddlebag. The assistant marshals faced a constant battle against the elements. If a rider fell into a creek or got caught in a summer thunderstorm, months of work could be washed away in seconds. To protect their ledgers, they used oilcloth wraps, canvas treated with linseed oil to make it waterproof, leather portfolios, heavy hide covers to prevent the sharp quill tips from puncturing the paper during a bumpy ride. In the humid heat of the southern states, the ink would sometimes take forever to dry, forcing the marshals to sprinkle pounce, a fine powder made from crushed bone or sand, over the wet names to prevent smudging. Every page was a labor of patience. As the summer of 1790 heated up, thousands of these handmade ledgers were being filled. Each stroke of the quill was a permanent record of a new American life, etched in iron and oak. Chapter 6. The Ink of 1790, a battle of fluid and fiber. While the political giants in Philadelphia debated the future of the nation, the success of the census rested on something much smaller: the chemical stability of a liquid. In the 18th century, quality control was a foreign concept, and for an assistant marshal, his bottle of ink was both his greatest tool and his worst enemy. The chemistry of permanence. The iron gall ink used by the marshals was a living, breathing substance. Because it was made from organic materials like oak galls and iron salts, it was highly acidic. This was intentional. The acid would slightly burn or etch into the paper fibers, making the records impossible to wash away, a vital feature for a legal document. However, this acidity was a double-edged sword. If the mixture was too strong, it could eventually eat through the paper, leaving lace-like holes where names once stood. Each marshal had his own secret recipe. Some added brandy or vinegar to prevent the ink from freezing in the northern winters, while others added honey to give the ink a glossy finish and better flow. The disaster of the leak. The greatest fear of a traveling marshal was a black leak. In the 1790s, ink was carried in small bottles made of lead, horn, or heavy glass, sealed with a simple cork. Imagine a marshal riding through the humid hills of North Carolina. His horse stumbles while crossing a rocky stream. Inside his leather saddlebag, the cork pops loose. Within minutes, the black, acidic fluid soaks into his hand-stitched ledger. A month's worth of data, the names of 500 families, becomes a chaotic black smudge. Records show that some marshals had to start their entire journey over because of such accidents. To prevent this, they began wrapping their inkwells in layers of greased leather or carrying dry ink, a powder that had to be mixed with water or wine on the spot. The quill, the precision instrument. Writing for 10 hours a day was a physical struggle. There were no metal nibs, there were only feathers. A marshal had to be an expert penknife user. Every few pages, the tip of the goose quill would become soft and blunt from the friction of the rough rag paper. The marshal would stop, take out a small penknife and precisely shave the feather to a new sharp point. If the slit in the quill was too wide, the ink would blot, a blob of ink. If it was too narrow, the writing would be scratchy and illegible. The rhythmic sound of the knife sharpening the quill became the background noise of the 1790 frontier. The paper's endurance. The paper itself was a marvel of the pre-industrial age. Because it was made from linen and cotton rags rather than wood, it lacked the lignin that causes modern paper to turn yellow and brittle. This rag paper was tough, almost like fabric. However, the lack of uniformity was a nightmare. One batch of paper might be smooth and sized, treated with animal glue to prevent ink from spreading, while the next batch might be as absorbent as a modern paper towel. A marshal had to adjust his writing style with every new sheet he bought from a local printer, fighting to keep the names of the citizens clear and crisp. The legacy of the ledger. As the months passed, these ledgers became heavy with the weight of thousands of names. They were stained with sweat, dusted with the red clay of Georgia or the gray soil of New England, and occasionally marked by a drop of candle wax from a late-night session by the fire. Yet, it was this specific combination, the iron-heavy ink and the rag fiber paper, that ensured that 236 years later, researchers could still look at those pages and see the bold, dark strokes of the men who counted the first Americans. They weren't just writing names, they were creating a permanent anchor for a new nation's history. Next 4. Into the Wild. By late 1790, the census takers had moved far beyond the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia and Boston. They were now pushing into the backcountry, the rugged, untamed frontier where the law was a distant memory and the map was mostly blank. The wilderness path. For an assistant marshal, the working day began at sunrise. There were no postal routes here. A rider might travel 20 miles through a mountain pass just to reach a single cluster of 3 cabins. They navigated by following notched trees or riverbeds, often sleeping under the stars with a saddle for a pillow and a loaded musket by their side. The dangers were very real. The terrain, flash floods could turn a dry creek into a raging river in minutes, threatening to drown the horse and dissolve the precious census ledgers. The predators. In the 1790s, wolves and panthers were a common threat to travelers in the Appalachian Range. The isolation. If a marshal's horse went lame or if he fell ill with frontier fever, malaria or typhoid, there was no doctor for 100 miles. The suspicious frontier. In the wilderness, the sight of a government official was often met with hostility rather than hospitality. To the rugged pioneers of the West, a man with a quill and a ledger looked like 2 things: a tax collector or a land speculator coming to steal their property. In many remote settlements, marshals were greeted with silence or pointed rifles. They had to explain, over and over again, that they weren't there to take money, but to ensure the people had a voice in the new government. It took a special kind of diplomacy, and often a shared jug of cider, to get a suspicious mountain man to list the names of his children and the ages of his sons. The ink under fire. The humidity of the southern swamps and the dust of the northern trails were the enemies of the written word. A marshal's inkwell was his most guarded possession. If it broke or leaked, he couldn't just buy more. He would have to stop his journey, find an oak tree to gather galls, and brew a fresh batch over a campfire. One marshal's diary from the era noted that his ink froze solid during an early October frost in the Vermont hills. He had to thaw the bottle over a small fire just to record the names of a family living in a nearby log hut. Every name was hard-earned. Every number was a victory over the vast, indifferent American wild. The census was no longer just an administrative task, it had become an expedition of discovery. Next to 9. The final tally. In the late summer of 1791, the final numbers were finally tallied in Philadelphia. The clerks had dipped their quills for the last time, their fingers permanently stained black from the iron Gall ink. The result was handed to Thomas Jefferson, who then presented it to President George Washington. The final number: 3,929,214 people. The shock of the number. Today, we think of 3.9 million as a small number, but for a new nation it was a moment of truth. However, there was a problem. Jefferson and Washington were disappointed. they had expected at least 4 million. To the Founding Fathers, a higher population meant more prestige on the world stage. It showed Europe that the American experiment was thriving and growing rapidly. Washington was convinced that the census was an undercount. He believed that many people, out of fear of taxes or pure suspicion of the government, had hidden in the woods when the Marshals came knocking. The power shift, despite the disappointment, the data was revolutionary. For the first time, the government could see exactly where the people were. Virginia was the giant of the era, with nearly 750,000 people. New York was growing fast, but was still smaller than Pennsylvania. The cities were tiny by modern standards. New York City had only about 33,000 people, and Philadelphia had 28,000. The ink on those ledgers immediately began to reshape the government. Based on these numbers, the House of Representatives was reorganized. Some states gained power, while others lost it. The census proved that the western frontier was expanding much faster than anyone had imagined. The financial cost: the entire operation had cost the government about $44,377. While that sounds small today, it was a massive investment for a country that was still struggling to pay off its war debts. Every penny had been accounted for, from the Marshals' travel expenses to the cost of the heavy paper and the ingredients for the ink. A presidential first. George Washington, frustrated by the lower-than-expected numbers, did something historic. He issued the first-ever presidential veto in US history regarding a bill that suggested how to divide the congressional seats based on these census results. He argued that the math was unfair to certain states. The census wasn't just a list of names anymore, it was the center of a constitutional crisis. It proved that in a democracy, numbers are power. The ink used by those 650 writers had created a map of political strength that would dictate the future of the American presidency. 7. The shadow population. As the Marshals moved through the grand plantations of the South and even some households in the North, the scratching of their quills had to record a dark and complex reality. The 1790 census was not just a map of freedom, it was a cold, mathematical ledger of bondage. The 3/5 Compromise. In Philadelphia, the politicians had made a cynical deal known as the 3/5 Compromise. This rule stated that for the purposes of representation in Congress, an enslaved person would be counted as only 3/5 of a human being. When an assistant marshal stood before a wealthy landowner in Virginia or South Carolina, he wasn't there to record the names of the enslaved people. Unlike the free white males or free white females, the enslaved population remained nameless in the official 1790 ledgers. They were simply numbers, tallies in a column at the far right of the page. The nameless count. For a marshal, counting the enslaved population was a grim exercise in accounting. He would walk through the slave quarters, counting heads like livestock, while the head of a white household had his full name written in bold, elegant iron gall ink. The hundreds of men, women, and children laboring in the fields were reduced to a single digit at the bottom of a sheet. The ink on these pages tells a story of systematic invisibility. You might see John Henderson, 4 free white males, 3 free white females. Across from his name, 42 enslaved persons. The census takers rarely spoke to the enslaved people. They took the word of the master for the count. This led to massive inaccuracies, as owners often manipulated the numbers depending on whether they wanted to appear more powerful or pay fewer taxes. The other free persons. There was another column in the 1790 ledger. All other free persons. This included free black Americans and, in some cases, taxed indigenous people living in settled areas. In cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, this column was a testament to a growing community of free black entrepreneurs, sailors, and laborers. However, for the Marshals, this was often the most confusing category. Many census takers, fueled by the prejudices of the time, struggled to categorize people who didn't fit into the simple boxes of white or enslaved. The silence of the records. One of the most haunting aspects of the 1790 census is the silence. There are millions of people, the backbone of the American economy at the time, whose identities were never captured by the Marshals' quill. Their ages, their birthplaces, and their stories were omitted. Yet historians today use these very ledgers to track the movement of people and the spread of slavery. The ink that was meant to hide their humanity ended up providing the evidence of their existence. The heavy, acidic ink etched the numbers deep into the parchment, ensuring that the world would never forget the scale of the shadow population that lived, worked, and died at the dawn of the American Republic. As the Marshals finished these difficult pages, they often had to wash the thick, black ink from their stained fingers, a physical reminder of the heavy, complicated work they were doing. The census was nearing completion, but the nation it revealed was deeply divided. To 8. The return to Philadelphia. By the early months of 1791, the 9-month deadline was looming. The scattered army of assistant marshals began their long, arduous trek back from the edges of the frontier. They were no longer carrying blank sheets of paper. They were carrying the weighted history of a nation. The heavy cargo, a completed census ledger, was a massive object. Some were over 2 feet tall, bound in heavy leather or rough canvas. For a marshal riding back from the hills of Georgia or the forests of Maine, these documents were more precious than gold. The journey back was arguably more dangerous than the journey out. If a horse slipped in a river crossing now, it wasn't just a bottle of ink that would be lost. It was the recorded identities of thousands of citizens. Marshals often wrapped their ledgers in multiple layers of oilcloth and animal skins, tying them securely to their saddles. The gathering at the Capitol. One by one, the Marshals began to trickle into Philadelphia. They arrived covered in the dust of the road, their clothes tattered, but their leather satchels intact. They headed straight for the office of the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a man obsessed with data and details, waited anxiously. He had a vision of a scientific America defined by its growth. As the Marshals laid their hand-stitched books on his long oak tables, the room began to smell of old parchment and the distinct metallic tang of iron gall ink. The task of synthesis. Jefferson and his small team of clerks faced a new nightmare: aggregation. Every marshal had used different handwriting. Some had used different spellings for the same names. Some had drawn their columns crookedly. The clerks had to sit by candlelight for weeks, their eyes straining as they manually added up the long columns of numbers from hundreds of different books. They used tally sheets, large grid papers where they transferred the data. The scratching of quills in the office was constant, a rhythmic pulse of a government trying to understand itself. It was during this process that the quality of the ink truly mattered. If a marshal had used cheap, watered-down ink, his records were now fading or smudged, forcing the clerks to guess or send a rider back for clarification. Jefferson's growing concern. As the numbers started to climb, Jefferson became worried. He had predicted a population of around 4 million, but as the tally progressed, the numbers seemed lower than he expected. He began to fear that the Marshals had missed people in the deep woods, or that citizens had hidden from the count. "The numbers are the heartbeat of the Republic," Jefferson wrote in a letter. "If the heartbeat is faint, the Republic is weak." The atmosphere in Philadelphia was electric. Political rivals gathered in taverns, whispering about the early leaks of the data. The census was no longer just a collection of names. It was becoming a political weapon. Chapter 10. A legacy in parchment. The year is no longer 1790, but the ink remains. The original ledgers of the first US Census did not disappear into the shadows of history. Instead, they became the foundation of the American story, a bridge between a chaotic revolution and a structured civilization, the survival of the scrolls. For decades, these heavy, leather-bound books were moved from one government cellar to another. They survived the War of 1812, where the British burned much of Washington, D.C. They survived the humidity of the Potomac and the neglect of early bureaucracy. The reason they survived? The chemistry we discussed in Chapter 3. The iron Gall ink had bonded so deeply with the rag-based paper that even as the pages yellowed, the names remained bold. Today, these original documents are housed in the National Archives, kept in climate-controlled vaults where the light is dim and the air is dry, protecting the strokes of the 650 marshals who rode into the wild. From names to ancestry, in the 20th and 21st centuries, these records took on a new life. What started as a political tool became a treasure map for millions of families. Because those marshals insisted on writing down the names of the heads of households with such care, people today can trace their lineage back to the very birth of the nation. Genealogists look at the 1790 census to find the exact moment their ancestors stepped out of the wilderness and into the record books. The scratchy handwriting of a tired marshal in 1790 is now a digital scan being viewed by a descendant in 2026. The evolution of the count, the 1790 census set a precedent that almost every nation on Earth eventually followed. It proved that a country could not be managed by guesswork. It led to the creation of the Permanent Census Bureau. It evolved from 6 simple questions to complex digital surveys. It moved from horseback and quills to satellites and supercomputers. The last drop of ink. The making of the US Census was more than a counting exercise. It was a feat of human endurance. It was about men who risked their lives for a tally, and a government that gambled its future on a bottle of homemade ink. As we look back at the 3.9 million people counted in 1790, we see the grit of a new nation. Every smudge, every faded line, and every carefully ruled column is a testament to the belief that in a democracy, everyone counts. The ink may have changed from iron and oak to pixels and code, but the mission remains the same: to define who we are, and where we are going. The end.